Hello and welcome to The Art of Conversation, a radio show dedicated to a college course dedicated to the art of conversation. This program is brought to you by the Eileen G. Jones Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media, and Journalism at Commonwealth University here in beautiful Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. I'm your host, Eric C. Miller, Professor of Communication Studies. This show is the official radio presence of Honors 211, The Art of Conversation, a course that focuses on the ancient art of dialectic, that is, the collaborative process by which knowledgeable peers pursue the truth through focused question and answer, back and forth, what is often called Socratic discussion. After a few weeks of wading through the theory on these matters, our students spend about 10 weeks in practice, holding twice-weekly 75-minute deep dives into topics and questions of their choosing. Our theme this semester is the good life in the Great Acceleration, and all of our content falls somewhere within this intentionally wide umbrella. During last week's season premiere, I talked a little bit about this concept of the Great Acceleration, defining it as a historical period from about 1945 to the present, in which human economic activity has experienced unprecedented growth with a host of benefits and liabilities for living creatures on this planet. The benefits include material abundance, easy access to food and medicine, and a generally higher quality of life, at least for many in the so-called developed world. The liabilities include pronounced economic inequalities, divisions, and a wide variety of increasingly dangerous environmental impacts associated with climate change. For better or worse, this should give us a lot to talk about this season. My guest today is friend of the program, Dr. Peter Doerschler, Professor of Political Science and Program Director of the Honors College here at Bloomsburg. Last October, Dr. Doerschler joined us to talk about the state of democracy, both at home and abroad. If you missed that episode, you can still find it on our YouTube channel. And if you listen to it now, I think you will notice a very palpable anxiety in his assessment of the situation. Democracy was under strain around the world, authoritarian candidates were rising to power, and the United States was moving steadily toward a very consequential presidential election. Now that this wave has rolled past, I wanted to bring Dr. Doerschler back on the show to get his take on where we stand now. Dr. Peter Doerschler, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Professor Miller. Great to be here. I look forward to our conversation.
When we sat down together last fall, and I asked you how you were feeling about the state of democracy, you told me you felt pretty anxious about it. How do you feel about it now?
Well, I've had a couple days to sleep on it, and I've got to say I think my anxiety was well-founded. I think we're in a very tenuous place right now with American democracy post-election as more and more things are rolling out, from executive orders to cabinet appointments to just the general state of how this administration is going to handle things. I think all of us should approach it with a great deal of concern and be ready for politics not as normal, but a new brand of politics that does not focus on democracy, democratic norms, civil liberties and civil rights, the rule of law, accountability, sort of the bedrocks, the foundation of democracy, but things that are much more in line with autocratic government, loyalty, presidential power, surrounding yourself with a group of individuals, the oligarchy as we now know it, that are ready to do a president's bidding. These are the things that are become the new norm, and we've got to adjust. We've got to critique and be ready to be critical citizens in assessing what comes next.
Donald Trump is president again, obviously. The second president in U.S. history after Grover Cleveland to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. And in the lead up to the election, you had joined a bunch of other commentators in characterizing Trump as a threat to democracy. And yet Trump managed to win the popular vote this time around, making him the choice of most American voters. So in that sense, he is perhaps a threat to democracy, but also the product of democracy. How do you think about that tension?
That is a very good question, and there is certainly some irony there. And we've seen it past cases where many autocratic leaders start out not through coups, although that's certainly possible in some cases. But by elections, they're elected into office. Hitler would be the prime example, but you could point to many others as well. And it's once they're in office that they're able to use the power of their office to erode the guardrails of democracy. And I think that is what we should expect to see. I hope not. I hope I'm terribly wrong, but there's been a lot of hinting, a lot of discussion on the campaign trail about what President Trump intends to do once in office. And we should fully expect him to use these newfound powers given to him by the Supreme Court. Presidents now have great immunity for official acts while in office. And he has clearly surrounded himself by loyalists instead of institutionalists, people who are ready to uphold democracy. These are people who are much more willing, I think, to do the president's bidding. And we should be very cautious with this new administration that it is setting a different course away from norm-based democracy, rule of law, and accountability towards really the whims and ideas of a single person.
In the short term, I felt some relief that Trump won the race outright, because this meant, on the one hand, that we would not have to endure another violent uprising like January 6th, or another election in which the second place finisher received an electoral college boost onto the trophy platform. This was a concern I know that we shared before the election and that a lot of people reported feeling. Should we feel good that a MAGA victory forestalled violence from MAGA supporters?
I think there is a silver lining there for sure. If you want to look at the election as a whole and take out the good of what happened, it would be that there was no political violence. And we live in a society where violence is commonplace, it's an everyday occurrence, and there was certainly a lot of concern that there would be a violence if the Democrats, if Kamala Harris had won, or if there was a very close contested election that went to the courts, that there would have been a repeat of January 6th, or there would have been violence on the streets. We didn't have that. So we have to be grateful that we were able to avoid that really the elections worked. It was a free and fair election by all accounts, as were the previous elections. We have many institutional flaws and problems that we need to overcome, but that is not one of them. Our election system held and did what it's supposed to do, and there was no violence, and that's all a good thing.
One of the first things that Trump did in office was issue a sweeping pardon for rioters from January 6th. What do you make of this practically or symbolically as one of the first moves that he makes?
Personally, I think it's a disgrace to all the Capitol Police and everybody involved in that day who were bludgeoned and attacked and hit and sprayed with, bear spray and all sorts of things. There was horrific injury. There was death. There was an attempt to overthrow an election and our democracy. There was a real insurrection at work by nefarious forces, these paramilitary groups, and they were rightfully convicted, many of them for long sentences, after fair trials, and all of that's been undermined. So that certainly is one of the reasons why I'm not particularly optimistic moving forward. A president's first act, or one of his first acts coming into office, is to pardon 1,500 of the January 6th rioters, commuting sentences and pardoning them. I think it sends a signal, getting to your question, that this sort of action is tolerable, that if you're going to be loyal to the president, he's got your back. If he asks you to do something that may sound illegal or involve violence, don't worry about it. He's got your back. That's the message I think it sends to everybody out there. And I think these paramilitaries, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, Proud Boys, they're going to be emboldened by this. They're going to be empowered. They're going to be back in action. Business is open again. And I think they're going to win new recruits, people who were a little fearful that the DOJ or law enforcement was going to crack down on them. There was no place for extremist views or actions or violence in American society, who are holding off committing to these kinds of groups, even if they shared views, are suddenly going to feel like the door is open. So I'm fearful of that.
I want to ask you real quickly about Kamala Harris. She was a qualified candidate. She was a U.S. Senator. She emphasized her past as a prosecutor. She was a vice president of the United States and ended up underperforming, losing this race pretty handily. Do you think that she ever really had a chance? Would things have been different if the primary had played out differently, if she had gotten a longer runway? Do you think that she was doomed from the start?
I think she was put into an impossible situation. If Biden had signaled early on that he was going to be a one-term president, allowed a real process to unfold where the party could, nominate from within their preferred candidate, perhaps she would have been that candidate. But I sort of doubt it based on the last nominating process where she underperformed and she didn't really garner a wide swath of support among Democrats. They preferred Biden, and that tells you something. And they preferred other candidates too. And even though she started off as one of the favorites, she faded quickly and wasn't great on the campaign trail, didn't resonate with a lot of voters. Doesn't mean she wasn't, credentialed and didn't have good ideas and isn't smart in anything, but I think her weaknesses as a politician, as somebody who can resonate with the common person were kind of exposed.
I'm persuaded by those who have criticized Trump's demagoguery in particular, the way he uses Latin American immigrants especially to stir up angry feelings among white Americans and then use those feelings to consolidate power for himself. And yet, Trump also saw his numbers increase significantly among Latino voters in this election. I'm not quite sure what to make of that. What do you make of it?
Yeah, that was something we weren't really expecting, even though I think some of the polls leading up to the election were indicating that Black men and Latinos were drifting towards Trump in greater numbers than they had in the past. I think it's his ability to resonate with a lot of ordinary people. His message of, the pocketbook, economic issues, the inflation, immigration crisis, the way he painted it is something that could impact everybody, regardless of your station in life or race, ethnicity. Like these identity politics, cultural issues, these are the things he railed against. And for certain people, they wanted to go with the economic pocketbook issues because that's what was affecting them. And maybe the Democrats, I think a lot of people are critiquing them that they've overplayed the identity politics, and I think Harris tried really hard not to. Right? She didn't make being a Black woman a central part of her campaign, and yet that's how people saw her, and that's how effective I think Trump and company were at painting her and the Democrats in the loss. And a lot of it's about, how effective you are on the campaign trail, painting somebody, even if it might not be fair, or if there's disinformation or lies involved, that, in politics, it's all fair game. And it's what the voters ultimately decide. And I think the Republicans in general were far more effective at that than the Democrats. And I think communication, media, they killed it.
I go back and forth personally between worrying that Trump will be a dictator and thinking that he's mostly a showman. He's either a Mussolini or a P.T. Barnum, mostly. Prior to his first term, he said that he was going to do a lot of troubling things. He was going to put Hillary Clinton in jail, etc. And then as soon as he won, he just put all that stuff to the side. He mostly slept late, played a lot of golf, but didn't try to persecute his enemies. Do you think that this Trump 2.0, is that same politician? Do you think he is substantively different now, given the experiences that he's had in the interim?
I tend to think probably not. He made his what he would term persecution by the courts, by the DOJ, by many around him for all sorts of things, all the lawsuits that were going on, right, took a toll on him, impacted his mentality and how he views the world, and he made retribution a central theme of his campaign. And I think that'll bleed over into his actual administration. If you take a look at his cabinet picks, the way he's going to run his office through Project 2025. I think the consolidation of power, the presidential immunity, and the loyalists that he's surrounded himself with is fundamentally different than 2016, when he was an outsider, but he stepped into an administration and an office where there were a lot of institutionalists around who could check his power. And he was very frustrated by that, obviously, because as a CEO, you're in charge, you make decisions, and the buck stops there. You're not used to people telling you, no, you can't do something. Now there are far fewer people around to do that. And I think his true intentions and all this retribution is going to come out. And I hope I'm wrong again. I hope that we can get back to some serious politics and serious issues, because we have an infinite number of them. But I feel like this is going to be Trump's retribution tour for the next couple of years at least.
In terms of his official policy agenda, is the 2024 slate of priorities similar to the 2016 slate of priorities?
Good question. I think there's a mix. You can take a look at the executive orders that he has signed in the last day. You can see a lot of similarities there. He has pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accords, for example. That was one of the first things that he signed, and back in 2016, he did the same thing. He has signed executive orders disbanding DEI offices and efforts inside of government, and that was something that was high on his priority list before as well. Immigration. He hasn't talked much about the border wall. He's talked more about the border crisis and I think taken steps even beyond the border wall. He's talked about declaring the drug cartels in Mexico as a foreign terrorist organization, which would allow him to use the military to attack those organizations inside another sovereign country. So while some of the issues may look the same, there is a possibility for an escalation of action trying to deal with them. So we'll have to see. I think on the foreign policy side, what's very interesting are some of the ideas that have come out since his election: purchasing Greenland, adopting Canada as a 51st state. I'm not sure how that would happen, but the idea is out there. And I think that's one of the brilliant things that he does as a marketer, is just sort of pitches ideas, kind of like we're the focus group. And he's just seeing what's going to stick. He'll throw out all kinds of crazy things, and that's a pretty crazy thing. Not only for us, but for the Canadians, and for the Greenlanders, and for the Panamanians in taking back the Panama Canal. He wants to see what's going to stick, what's possible, and I think his agenda is based on that. I don't think he has a to-do list necessarily in front of him. It's just sort of like shop some ideas around and go from there.
For at least the third consecutive administration now, we have a president who controls all of government, has the Senate, the House. So a two-part question, I suppose. What do you make of the way that control of government kind of swings uniformly back and forth in this way? And do you think that the Republicans in Congress will serve as any sort of check on Trump's ambitions, or are they going to give him free rein to do what he wants?
Yeah, I mean, unitary government is certainly an outcome that we have experienced many times throughout our history, but we've also had divided government many times. And more recently, if you look at the last 50 years, we've had more divided government than unitary government. So to have a unitary government where one party controls the executive and the legislative branches and both chambers in Congress gives that party a significant mandate. And that's certainly a word that's being used a lot. Mandate meaning control, power to get their agenda done. And for others not to really stand in their way. The people have spoken. They have elected these people. Stand aside. Let us do what we were elected to do. So I think that's certainly the image that the president and the rest of the party are presenting and what they're hoping. There are still plenty of checks in place. It's just a question of how effective those checks are going to be. Something I talked last time on the show is this idea of American institutions being a bit flawed and hurting a majority party to get things done, that we are very, very counter-majoritarian with things like a filibuster and our electoral college. When you're in opposition, it's a great thing. When you're in power, it's a terrible thing. But overall, it's really hurt sort of the effectiveness of governance. in our country, because we can't tackle big issues unless we come up with some consensus. And that's difficult when our parties have drifted apart from each other. So I think even with a unitary government, it's going to be difficult. But to your second point, the rifts inside the GOP, can the GOP stay together? Because that's what Trump needs, even as he promises and I think expects to sign more executive orders. And he's also talked about disregarding court orders and things like that. So I think he's going to stretch the kind of presidential power as far as he possibly can, and then some. But at the end of the day, for big bills and laws, he needs congressional support. And right now he's got it. He's in this honeymoon phase. And newly elected presidents go through a period in time right after election when their party is euphoric, they're beholden to them. They're looking to get as much agenda passed as possible because they know in 2 years things could flip around very quickly. So I think the GOP is going to try really hard to stick together. Can they, though? That is another question, because there's some really interesting divides inside the party that are going to make that very difficult. And one of the really interesting things, I think, are the ultra-conservative deficit hawks, people like Chip Roy, who have come out really against some of the initial Trump agenda, which was going to blow up the deficit ceiling. You had these deficit hawks, the most conservative members of Congress say, no, are you kidding me? Like, raise the debt ceiling? That goes fundamentally against what we believe. So Trump's going to have to win them over, as well as the people who are just going to do his calling, because I think there are plenty of those people too, sort of the loyalists, if you will, inside the GOP, who are just going to show deference to him and fealty to him. But then there are those who are a little more principled, and whether or not they stay on board or for how long is a really good question.
One of the first things Trump did after winning the election was announce the appointment of Representative Matt Gaetz as Attorney General. And the Republicans in Congress basically said no. Like, that's a bridge too far. He had resigned from Congress just days before the release of an ethics report with all kinds of seedy stuff about his personal life. But I thought it was notable that the Republicans in Congress denied Trump really one of the first things that he asked for. I also think Speaker Mike Johnson has turned out to be a pretty interesting character in that he's kept a job that's very difficult to keep. He was reelected to that post on the first ballot this last time around, which was an accomplishment. And he has consistently been successful working with Democrats in the House to get legislation passed when a bunch of, especially the more hardline Republicans, wouldn't support it. So what do you make of Mike Johnson in particular and his role in the second Trump administration?
He is an interesting character, and, he's an arch conservative, there's no doubt, but I think somebody who's willing to work across aisles, especially given his very thin majority. If he had a large majority in place in the House, things might be different. He wouldn't have to rely on Democrats, but with just a couple seat majority, he really does in a lot of cases, given that his party has these fissures, divides in it. And he can't rely on them to come together as often as he would like. There's the Freedom Caucus, there are the deficit hawks, there are the MAGA types, there are the Republicans in blue states who have to be a lot more moderate to their constituents. So he's got to juggle a lot. He's got a very diverse caucus. And bringing them all together, he has done a really good job of that. I think just objectively, he's shown a lot of leadership in bringing his party together. But he's also willing to reach across aisles, which has garnered him some attacks from those on the right, who the no compromisers. It's the only way he can get things done. I think he's a pragmatist, I guess, at least partially, because he realizes if he doesn't do a little bit of that, he's not going to achieve a lot of his agenda.
What do you think Trump's victory means for the future of Ukraine?
It seemed very apparent that Ukraine's days of getting massive amounts of support from the United States were numbered. Trump seemed to signal that he wanted to bring the conflict to a quick end, that he was much more supportive of Putin, has been in the past, than of Ukraine. But let's not rush into that quite yet. I'm not sure that the United States, that Trump, is necessarily going to cozy up with Putin as much as we have feared he might. I think he wants to model himself after Putin, surrounding himself with oligarchs and acquiring more presidential power and building an American empire that's reminiscent of what Putin is trying to do through his invasions. But we'll have to see where that goes, because I'm not sure what Trump has signaled in the past is necessarily going to play out. He may realize that there's more there, that keeping Ukraine sort of in the West and has more benefits to him and to allies than meets the eye.
So looking ahead, what does the outcome of this election mean for the two parties? What does the Democratic Party have to do to retake power? And what does the Republican Party do now that they have a president who is essentially a lame duck? Is J.D. Vance the heir apparent? Are they going to consider other candidates and move in other directions? Where do you see American politics going over the course of the next 4 years?
For the Democrats first, I would say that any losing party has to engage in a reckoning, a postmortem. Like, what went wrong? Why did they lose? And they're going to have to be very introspective. They're going to have to think about why they didn't resonate, especially with a lot of working class voters. That was the group that they lost. And again, as I've touched upon, I think some of their issues were out of touch with that population. Even though Harris, I think, did a pretty good job of trying to steer things back towards pocketbook issues. I think for the Democrats, honestly, finding what is their calling going to be? What's the message going to be? They've got to find something that resonates with the common folks out there. And right now, the GOP has that. They've captured the working class. There's no doubt about that. And to win a national election, the Democrats have to find that message. And it's got to be economic. Is it going to be a populist economic message? Are you going to have a Bernie Sanders come out and try to fire up the American working class around the evils of big industry and things like that, or is it going to be more of the institutionalist message of a Josh Shapiro or somebody like that? For the GOP, an heir to Trump, what will happen to the MAGA movement going on? And I think turning it from Trump, from the outsider single candidate party into a real movement is what he's tried to do. I think that's a difference between 2016 and the present, is that it was basically Trump doing this by himself, it seemed like, and now there's more of a movement behind him. These loyalists, these oligarchs, these broader base of support. And I think that's what the GOP is. I mean, it's really the MAGA party. It's got a nationalist, populist kind of center to it. It's not the old institutions of the GOP. Those folks have been weeded out. None of them were at the convention. None of the Bushes or Romneys or people like that. They've been completely ostracized from the party. So the party has remade itself, refashioned itself, and been so successful in realigning American politics by taking the core working class voter base that was the heart of the Democratic Party forever. So what happens after Trump? What happens after this movement? That's a great question, because there's no heir apparent. I think more likely is that you're going to have a power struggle play out inside the GOP between the Steve Bannon types, the MAGA loyalists, the true believers, if you will, in the movement and in the values, and the opportunists like Musk, some of the other tech moguls who have been in and around Trump world these days. People who are there at the bowl right now trying to influence what goes on inside Trump world and influence to help them. So we'll have to see how this plays out, but I think a power struggle.
Dr. Peter Doerschler, thank you for joining us on the show today.
My pleasure. I hope you have a great conversation about this, and I look forward to hearing about it later. Thanks.
This has been another episode of the Art of Conversation Radio here on 91.1 WHSK. This program is brought to you by the Eileen G. Jones Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media, and Journalism at Commonwealth University. I am your host, Eric C. Miller, Professor of Communication Studies. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. time.